Every sea creature alive today is a survivor. The ocean killed almost everything else. We are talking about a sea that ran on poison, grew monsters the size of school buses, and reset itself 5 times by wiping out almost all life. Giant bone-plated fish, 8-foot predators with no eyes, an extinction so bad it took 10 million years to bounce back. We will go from the very first drop of ocean water to the creatures that outlived every disaster. If you enjoy this, subscribe. You will want to see what comes next. Brace yourself, we begin. The ocean was not always blue. 4 billion years ago, if you could somehow stand on the edge of the earliest sea, the water stretching out in front of you would look dark, reddish, almost purple, and the smell would have driven you back immediately. Sulfur, iron, something chemical and wrong. The air itself would have killed you in minutes. The water would have done it faster. This was Earth's first ocean, and understanding it means understanding just how alien our own planet used to be. Here is where it gets strange. The water covering early Earth did not fall from clouds the way rain does today. A big chunk of it arrived from space. Billions of years ago, during a period scientists call the Late Heavy Bombardment, asteroids and comets slammed into Earth over and over. Many of those space rocks carried ice. That ice melted on impact. Over hundreds of millions of years, the crashes kept coming, and the water kept building up. At the same time, volcanoes all over the planet were erupting constantly, pumping steam into the atmosphere. That steam condensed and fell. So the first oceans were born from space delivery and volcanic pressure combined, not from a gentle rain cycle. The result was a sea full of dissolved iron, sulfur compounds, and almost zero oxygen. Scientists know this because of ancient rock formations called banded iron formations, stripes of rust-coloured rock locked into cliffs all over the world, proof that the early ocean was saturated with iron the way a glass of water gets saturated with sugar. But here is the part that flips everything you picture about the sea. The light hitting that early ocean carried ultraviolet radiation at levels that would shred modern DNA in seconds. There was no ozone layer to block it. The ocean surface was essentially a radiation zone. Anything alive had to stay deep or find shelter under rock or evolve chemistry that could handle the punishment. And yet, life found a way. Scientists have found evidence of microscopic life in rocks dating back nearly 4 billion years. Single-celled organisms, no bigger than a speck of dust, living in water with almost no oxygen and temperatures that swung wildly. These were not the kind of creatures that needed sunlight or clean water. They fed on chemical reactions. They exhaled compounds toxic to almost everything alive today. They were, by every modern standard, completely alien. The purple colour that gave this era its nickname, the Purple Earth Hypothesis, came from a pigment called retinol. Scientists think some early microbes used retinol to absorb sunlight instead of chlorophyll, the green pigment plants use today. If those microbes dominated the early ocean surface, they would have stained it purple and red, the way algae blooms can turn modern lakes green or red. An ocean the colour of a bruise, breathing poison, lit by a sun that would burn through your skin in seconds. And somewhere in that toxic, dark, pressurised water, the first sparks of life were already experimenting, already competing, already beginning the chain of survival that would eventually, after billions of years and 5 near-total extinctions, produce every creature in the ocean today. The surface was a death zone. The deep was barely survivable. But deep under the sea floor, in places where heat cracked through the rock, something was happening that would change everything. The water you swim in today is ancient beyond imagination. Some of it arrived on this planet before the planet even finished forming. That fact alone should stop you cold. Scientists have traced the chemical signature of Earth's water and found it matches the water locked inside a specific type of asteroid called carbonaceous chondrites. These space rocks formed in the outer solar system, billions of miles from Earth, in regions cold enough for ice to exist. Then gravity pulled them inward. They collided with early Earth at speeds that make a bullet look slow, and when they hit, they delivered water. Picture a surface covered in constant explosions, craters forming faster than they could cool, the whole planet glowing orange from heat. Every few thousand years, another massive rock from space slamming in, and each one carrying a little more water to the growing ocean. But the asteroids alone did not fill the seas. Volcanoes did the rest. Early Earth had far more volcanic activity than it does today, because the interior was hotter and the crust was thinner. Eruptions pumped enormous amounts of water vapour, carbon dioxide and sulphur into the atmosphere. When that steam cooled even slightly, it fell as rain. Acid rain, because it mixed with carbon dioxide and sulphur on the way down, but rain nonetheless. That rain pooled in the lowest points of the crust. Over hundreds of millions of years, those pools grew into seas. Scientists have a way of knowing this. Ancient zircon crystals, some of the oldest solid material ever found on Earth, carry chemical signatures suggesting liquid water existed on this planet as far back as 4.4 billion years ago. That is only about 150 million years after Earth itself formed. The ocean arrived almost immediately in geological terms, and here is something that almost nobody talks about. Those first oceans were hot. Wildly hot. Temperatures near the surface may have been close to 180 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough to cook most modern sea life on contact. The early ocean was not a gentle cradle. It was closer to a simmering pot. The chemistry was just as brutal. Dissolved metals, primarily iron and magnesium, flooded the water. Sulfur compounds from volcanic vents made sections of the ocean smell like a burning match. The water was slightly acidic, and the pressure at even moderate depths was crushing. A modern fish dropped into those ancient seas would have been dead within seconds from the chemistry alone, before the temperature or pressure even had a chance. What kept the water from just evaporating in the heat was atmospheric pressure. Early Earth had a thick atmosphere, much denser than today's, and that pressure kept water in liquid form even at high temperatures. It worked like a pressure cooker, holding the ocean in place while the planet slowly cooled over millions of years. That cooling process was not smooth. It was interrupted by more asteroid impacts, more volcanic pulses, more sudden swings in temperature. The early ocean was never stable. It was always reacting. And yet, in all of that chaos and heat and poison, something was stirring. Deep on the ocean floor, in cracks where heat escaped from the planet's interior, chemistry was getting complicated in a very specific way. What happened in those cracks is one of the most debated and most incredible stories in all of science. The seafloor was cracking open, and something was coming out. At the bottom of the early ocean, in places where tectonic plates pulled apart, superheated water came blasting up through the rock. These were hydrothermal vents, cracks in the seafloor that shot out water, reaching temperatures of over 700 degrees Fahrenheit. In the open ocean, water that hot would have instantly vaporized. But under the crushing pressure of the deep sea, it stayed liquid. It carried dissolved minerals, and it created a chemical environment unlike anything on the surface. Scientists have spent decades arguing about where life first appeared on Earth. Two main camps have formed. One group thinks life started in shallow tide pools on the surface, where sunlight and lightning could drive chemical reactions. The other group thinks life started deep in hydrothermal vents, where heat and mineral-rich water provided the energy and raw materials life needed. And over the last 20 years, the vent theory has been winning. Here is why. When you look at the chemistry of hydrothermal vents, something remarkable lines up. The minerals coming out of those vents, primarily iron and sulfur compounds, are almost identical to the minerals found inside the proteins at the core of nearly every living cell on Earth today. Scientists noticed this pattern and started asking a dangerous question. What if the first living chemistry did not build itself from scratch? What if it borrowed the mineral structure of the vent itself, using the rock as a kind of scaffold? One specific type of vent supports this idea especially well. They are called alkaline hydrothermal vents, and they operate differently from the black smokers you might have seen footage of. Alkaline vents release water that is warm rather than scorching, around 160 degrees Fahrenheit, and the chemical difference between the vent fluid and the surrounding seawater creates a natural electrical gradient, a tiny voltage difference, just like the one that powers your own cells. Scientists think those natural voltage gradients could have driven the first chemical reactions that copied themselves. A molecule that could make a copy of itself in a vent environment would have had everything it needed to survive: heat for energy, minerals for structure, chemical gradients for power. The actual moment life crossed from chemistry to biology, the first molecule that truly replicated itself, has never been caught in the act. Scientists have come close in laboratory experiments, creating self-copying chemistry under vent-like conditions. But the exact spark, the specific moment when a chain of chemistry became something we would call alive, remains one of the deepest open questions in science. What we do know is this: the oldest traces of life found so far come from rocks in Canada, ancient seafloor material dating back nearly 4 billion years. Inside those rocks are microscopic tubes and filaments, structures that look exactly like the kind of microbial mats that grow around hydrothermal vents today. The shapes match, the chemistry matches. Life may have started in the darkest, hottest, most pressurized place on Earth, and once it started there, it spread, slowly, microscopically, into every crack and shadow of the ancient ocean. And what those first creatures were doing inside that ocean was something no one predicted. They could not see, they could not think, they could not feel anything we would recognize, but they were eating. The earliest life in the ocean was microbial, single cells, smaller than the period at the end of this sentence. These organisms had no nucleus, no organs, and no behavior in any meaningful sense. What they had was chemistry, a set of molecular reactions that let them pull energy out of their environment, grow slightly, and divide in two, then do it again. Scientists call these organisms prokaryotes, and their descendants are still everywhere on Earth today, inside your gut, in the soil under your feet, in the water coming out of your tap. But the ancient versions were operating in an ocean with no oxygen, no sunlight reaching the deep, and chemistry so different from today that most of our modern biology would have stopped working completely. These early microbes were split into two camps based on where they got their energy. Some lived near hydrothermal vents and pulled energy directly from chemical reactions, combining hydrogen with carbon dioxide and releasing methane as a byproduct. Scientists call this methanogenesis, and these organisms were essentially eating rock chemistry. Others found ways to use sunlight in a primitive way, harvesting it with pigments that had nothing to do with the chlorophyll plants used today. Neither group breathed oxygen. Oxygen was actually dangerous to them. The chemistry inside their cells relied on reactions that oxygen destroys. These creatures thrived precisely because the ocean had almost none. Now here is the part that feels impossible. These microbes, essentially living bags of chemistry with no decision-making ability at all, ran the entire ocean for almost 2 billion years. 2 billion years! That is almost half the age of Earth itself. For all of that time, the most complex creature in the sea was something you needed a microscope to find. No predators, no prey in any real sense. Just microbes dividing, competing for chemicals, dying, and being recycled by other microbes. The ocean was a planet-wide chemical factory with no passengers, only workers. But some of these organisms were doing something that would change the entire planet without knowing it. A group called cyanobacteria evolved a new trick. They figured out how to split water molecules using sunlight. The byproduct of that reaction was oxygen gas. They pumped it into the water, then into the air, and the ocean had no idea what was coming. Because oxygen, the very thing that every complex creature on Earth now depends on to survive, was about to become the most catastrophic pollutant the ocean had ever seen. The microbes releasing it had no idea. They were doing what they always did, pulling in sunlight and chemicals, releasing waste products. but their waste was slowly building up, accumulating, reaching concentrations the ocean chemistry had never encountered. The change was coming. It would take millions of years, and when it arrived, it would come not as a dramatic event, but as a slow, chemical tide rising through the water. Most life in the ocean would not survive it. They looked like layered stones, ancient, grey, silent, sitting in shallow water and doing nothing obvious. But about 2.4 billion years ago, creatures exactly like them committed what scientists sometimes call the first mass murder in Earth's history. Stromatolites are structures built by cyanobacteria, the same microbes that evolved the ability to use sunlight to split water. They form slowly, layer by layer, as mats of bacteria grow, photosynthesize, trap sediment, and die. The dead layers harden into rock. New layers grow on top. Over thousands of years, these mats build up into domed columns that can reach several feet tall. In places like Shark Bay in Australia, living stromatolites still exist today, and they look nearly identical to fossils found in rocks nearly 3.5 billion years old. They are the oldest complex structures made by life on Earth, and they almost ended everything. The process that makes stromatolites is photosynthesis, and the byproduct of photosynthesis is oxygen. A single cyanobacterium produces a tiny amount of oxygen, but layer 1 trillion of them across the shallow ocean floor, let them run for hundreds of millions of years, and the amount of oxygen they release becomes enormous. For most of the early ocean's history, that oxygen got absorbed immediately. Iron dissolved in the seawater grabbed onto oxygen molecules as fast as the bacteria could produce them, forming iron oxide, which sank to the sea floor. This is where Earth's massive deposits of iron ore came from, ancient rusting on a global scale. But eventually the iron ran low. There was less and less dissolved metal to absorb the oxygen, and the oxygen started building up in the water. Then it started leaking into the atmosphere. Scientists have a name for what happened next, the Great Oxidation Event, and for the creatures living in the ocean at the time, it was a catastrophe. Here is the problem. Almost every microbe in the ocean at that point had spent billions of years evolving in a world without oxygen. Their chemistry was built for it. Oxygen molecules are chemically aggressive. They react with the proteins and cell membranes that early microbes were made of. For those ancient organisms, oxygen was not air. It was acid. It was fire. As oxygen levels rose, whole populations of microbes collapsed. Ancient ecosystems that had persisted for billions of years vanished. Some estimates suggest that the Great Oxidation Event killed off a greater percentage of Earth's living species than any other extinction event in history, including the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs, and the stromatolites kept going, dividing, photosynthesizing, pumping out more oxygen. What saved life on Earth was complexity. In the oxygen-rich zones near the surface, a new kind of cell began to appear, cells that could use oxygen in their chemistry instead of being destroyed by it. These were the ancestors of every plant, animal and fungus alive today, including every creature that would ever swim in the ocean. Life did not just survive the poison. Life learned to run on it, and once it did, the ocean was about to get a lot more crowded. Something was coming, something with eyes. Think about the worst environmental disaster you have ever heard of, then multiply it across the entire planet, stretch it over millions of years, make it invisible. That is the Great Oxidation Event, and scientists are still trying to figure out exactly how catastrophic it was. It happened roughly 2.4 billion years ago, though the full process stretched across hundreds of millions of years. The evidence is written in the rock record in multiple ways. Before the event, you find certain minerals in ancient river sediments, sulfide minerals that only survive when there is little to no oxygen in the atmosphere. After the event, those minerals vanish. In their place, you find iron oxide, oxidized rock, rust, all over the world. The same chemical shift recorded on every continent. Oxygen levels in the atmosphere before the event were probably less than 1% of what they are today. After the Great Oxidation Event peaked, oxygen had risen to somewhere around 1 to 2%. That sounds small. But for organisms that had never encountered free oxygen before, even a tiny increase was lethal. Here is what made it so destructive. The early ocean was not one ecosystem. It was thousands of separate microbial communities, each one slightly different depending on local chemistry, depth, temperature, and mineral availability. Some were in shallow water, some were in the deep ocean, some lived in seafloor sediments, and nearly all of them had one thing in common. Their core biology was built around the assumption that oxygen would remain rare. When oxygen flooded in, it triggered what scientists call oxidative stress. Oxygen molecules attacked the proteins inside cells, damaged their membranes, interfered with their energy-producing chemistry. Modern cells have complex defenses against this, enzymes that break down dangerous oxygen compounds before they cause damage. Those ancient cells had almost none of those defenses because they had never needed them. Most died. Some retreated to places where oxygen could not reach, the deep sediments, underwater volcanic zones, the gut of other organisms. The descendants of those survivors are still alive today. Scientists call them anaerobic organisms, creatures that still cannot tolerate oxygen, living in the same low-oxygen refuges their ancestors fled to billions of years ago. But the Great Oxidation Event did something else, something that barely gets mentioned. It triggered the first global ice age. Here is how. Before the event, the atmosphere was thick with methane, a powerful greenhouse gas pumped out by the very microbes the oxygen was now killing. Methane kept the planet warm, but oxygen reacts with methane and destroys it. As oxygen rose, methane fell, and as methane fell, the warming effect collapsed. Global temperatures plunged, ice sheets spread across the planet. Some scientists think Earth froze almost completely right down to the tropics, a poisoning followed by a freeze. The ocean went from a warm, iron-rich, methane-heavy world to an oxygenated, colder, chemically transformed one. Almost nothing that had existed before the event survived it in the same form, and yet, out of that frozen, oxygen-rich aftermath, something was beginning to grow that the world had never seen. Cells were getting bigger, more complex. They were starting to work together. The ocean was changing in a way that would produce its first true predators. 540 million years ago, something snapped in the ocean, and nothing was ever the same. For almost 3 billion years, life in the sea had been invisible. Microbes, simple, spread thin across the water like a film. Then, in what geologists call a blink, the fossil record exploded. Skeletons, shells, claws, eyes, legs, mouths with teeth. In the space of roughly 20 million years, which sounds long but is a fraction of a percent of Earth's history, almost every major body plan of animal life on Earth appeared in the ocean for the first time. Scientists call this the Cambrian explosion, and it is one of the most debated events in biology. The question is why it happened when it did. Life had existed for 3 billion years without producing anything like an animal. Then suddenly the ocean was full of them. What changed? Several factors came together. Oxygen levels had risen enough to support larger, more energy-hungry bodies. The chemistry of the ocean had shifted. Calcium carbonate, the mineral that makes shells and bones, had become more available in the water. And something else happened that may have been the trigger. Predation appeared. Once the first creatures evolved that could eat other creatures, the entire game changed. Before predation, there was no advantage to having a shell, no advantage to having eyes, no advantage to being fast or hard or spiky. But the moment something in the ocean started hunting, all of those traits suddenly became the difference between surviving and being eaten. Evolution accelerated. Arms races began. What the Cambrian seas actually looked like is something paleontologists have spent careers trying to reconstruct. The Burgess Shale in Canada gave scientists a window into that world. preserved in extraordinary detail thousands of soft-bodied creatures from 508 million years ago frozen in the rock like photographs. What they found was a world stranger than science fiction. Creatures with 5 eyes and a trunk-like feeding arm, animals with bodies like a stack of plates covered in spines, segmented swimmers that look like shrimp wrapped in armour, things with no clear head or tail, body plans that do not match anything alive today. One creature stood above all of them. It moved through the Cambrian seas as the largest predator in the ocean, reaching lengths of over 3 feet, the size of a large dog, enormous by the standards of a world where most animals were still smaller than your finger. It had compound eyes capable of seeing in detail no earlier ocean creature could match. It had circular jaw-like structures that could seize prey and crush it, and it had swimming flaps along its sides that let it glide through the water with precision. Scientists named it Anomalocaris, and for millions of years it was the top of the food chain. But something about Anomalocaris changed the ocean in a way that went beyond predation. It looked at things. It was the size of a golden retriever and built like a nightmare. Anomalocaris swam the Cambrian Ocean over 500 million years ago, and for its time, it was the most advanced predator Earth had ever produced. Scientists pieced it together slowly, because when they first found its parts as separate fossils, they thought they were looking at 3 completely different animals. The circular jaw structure was mistaken for a jellyfish. The clawed feeding arms were catalogued as shrimp. Only later did a full specimen reveal that all the pieces belonged to one animal. Once scientists saw the complete picture, everything shifted. Anomalocaris was roughly 2 feet long on average, with some specimens suggesting individuals reached 3 feet or more, making it the largest known animal in the Cambrian Ocean. It used 2 long, spiny appendages at the front of its head to grab prey and pull it toward a mouth ringed with hard, overlapping plates that could close like a camera shutter. For decades, scientists assumed it was crushing trilobites with that jaw. But something interesting came up when they examined the structure of the jaw more closely. The plates do not seem to have been rigid enough to crack the hard shells of the large trilobites. Some scientists now think Anomalocaris may have been a filter feeder for at least part of its diet, using its appendages to catch soft-bodied creatures and small organisms drifting through the water. The apex predator of the Cambrian Ocean may have also eaten like a whale shark. That detail is still being worked out. What is certain is that Anomalocaris dominated its ecosystem for an extraordinary amount of time. Its body plan persisted through tens of millions of years of Cambrian evolution. Fossils of related species have turned up on nearly every continent, suggesting its family spread across the global ocean. But what made Anomalocaris truly different from almost everything before it were its eyes. Scientists studied fossilized eye structures from Anomalocaris and found compound eyes built from thousands of individual lenses, similar in structure to the eyes of modern insects and crustaceans. Each eye was about 1 inch across, mounted on stalks, giving the animal a wide field of view. Based on the structure of those lenses, researchers calculated that Anomalocaris had visual resolution comparable to a modern dragonfly. It could see detail at a distance. It could track moving prey. In an ocean that had spent 3 billion years full of organisms that could not see at all, this was a revolution. The creature that hunted you could now spot you from across the water column. It could judge your distance, track your movement, and adjust its approach. For every creature in that ocean, being visible suddenly meant being vulnerable. The pressure to become harder, faster, smaller, or better, camouflage became enormous. Eyes had arrived in the ocean, and they would drive an arms race that would reshape every creature in the sea. What followed was stranger still, because sight changed predators, but it also changed prey in ways that nobody expected. Before eyes, survival was simple. Avoid the chemical signal that meant something was eating nearby. Drift, filter, reproduce. The ocean ran on chemical awareness, like a world where every creature navigated entirely by smell. Then something evolved a structure that could detect light. A patch of cells on the surface of a worm-like creature, maybe 500 million years ago, became sensitive enough to tell the difference between bright and dark. Scientists call this a primitive eye spot. It was barely a sensor. It could not form an image, but it could tell its owner which direction light was coming from, and by extension, which direction shadows were coming from. Shadows meant something large was passing overhead. Something large passing overhead in an ocean full of hungry creatures meant danger. A creature that could detect a shadow and react to it, even a fraction of a second faster, survived more often than one that could not. That tiny advantage, repeated across millions of generations, drove the most rapid arms race in the history of animal evolution. Eye spots became cups. Cups became spheres. Spheres developed lenses. Lenses focused light into images. In geological terms, it happened almost instantly. A period called the Cambrian radiation is directly tied to the spread of eyes. Some scientists have proposed the light switch theory, the idea that the evolution of image-forming eyes in predators was the trigger that caused the Cambrian explosion itself. Once something could see you, being invisible mattered. Shells appeared, spines appeared, camouflage appeared, size increased, speed increased. Every defensive and offensive feature that defines animal bodies today emerged in a rush, driven by the sudden pressure of being seen. In the ancient ocean, the creatures with the best eyes won. Anomalocaris had compound eyes with thousands of lenses. Trilobites, the armoured arthropods that became some of the most common Cambrian creatures, also developed compound eyes. Some trilobite species had eyes that covered nearly their entire head, giving them a field of view close to 360 degrees. But the predators were also gaining, and the prey were adapting faster than ever before. Shells got thicker. Some creatures buried themselves in sediment. Others developed false eye spots to confuse attackers. The same tricks you see in modern insects and fish were being invented in the Cambrian Ocean 500 million years ago. One result of this arms race was something that changed not just sight, but movement. Creatures needed to respond fast. That required a more complex nervous system. More complex nervous systems required more complex brains. The Cambrian Ocean drove the first push toward the kind of rapid, coordinated nervous systems that eventually, hundreds of millions of years later, would produce the first animals capable of learning. The ocean had produced the eye, and the eye had changed everything. But the era of Anomalocaris would not last forever. The ocean was about to shift again into something colder, deeper, and dominated by creatures that would look even stranger. The Cambrian Ocean was shallow, warm, chaotic, and new. The Ordovician Ocean, which began about 485 million years ago, was something different. The continents were still bunched together near the equator and South Pole, leaving enormous open oceans stretching between them. Sea levels were higher than they are today by hundreds of feet, flooding the edges of every landmass on Earth. The water was warm in the tropics and cold near the poles, but unlike today, the poles had almost no ice. The ocean was a single, massive connected system, circulating heat across the planet. And it was packed with life in a way the Cambrian Ocean never was. The Ordovician is sometimes called the Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event. The number of distinct species in the ocean multiplied by about 3 times during this period. Corals appeared. Sea lilies, called crinoids, covered the seafloor in forests. Brachiopods, creatures with 2 shells and a complex feeding structure, spread across every ocean floor. Graptolites, colonial animals that drifted in the open water, left fossil trails across shale formations on every continent. But what ruled the open water was stranger than almost anything that came before. Nautiloids, the ancestors of today's nautilus, had diversified into over 2,500 species by the Ordovician. Some were coiled, some were curved, and some were straight. The straight-shelled ones are where things get remarkable. These creatures built conical shells that could reach lengths of over 20 feet, longer than most modern cars. They were essentially jet-propelled predators. They pulled water into their shells and pushed it out through a siphon to move forward, then grabbed prey with tentacles the way an octopus does today. Imagine a 20-foot stone cone moving through the water, trailing tentacles. That was the top predator of the Ordovician Ocean for millions of years. The seafloor was equally strange. Trilobites, which survived the Cambrian and kept evolving, had diversified into thousands of species in the Ordovician. Some had spines so elaborate they look almost decorative. Some had crescent-shaped heads wider than their bodies. Some were tiny. Some grew to over 2 feet long, making them the largest arthropods in the ocean at the time. Scientists have found Ordovician trilobites that could roll into a perfect ball, like a prehistoric pill bug, presumably to protect their softer undersides from predators. The ocean floor had its own architecture. Reef systems built by ancient corals and sponges created habitats as complex as anything alive today. Fish appeared, jawless and strange, covered in bony plates and filtering food from the sediment. Everything was building towards something bigger, something more complex, something that would drive the ocean to its most diverse state since life began. And then it all almost died. A change was coming from the south. A massive, grinding, geological cold front that would freeze the polar regions, drop sea levels, and drain the shallow continental seas that housed most of the ocean's life. What happened next would leave the ocean unrecognizable. Picture a javelin made of stone. Now make it 20 feet long, give it tentacles. That is roughly what Orthoceras looked like, and it was one of the most successful predators the Ordovician Ocean ever produced. Orthoceras was a cephalopod, meaning it was related to today's squids, octopuses, and nautiluses. But where modern cephalopods have soft, flexible bodies, Orthoceras carried a rigid conical shell. The shell was divided inside into hollow chambers, like a series of sealed rooms stacked end to end. By adjusting the amount of gas and liquid in those chambers, the animal could control its buoyancy, rising or sinking in the water column without using its muscles. This is the same basic system the Nautilus uses today. Orthoceras had it figured out nearly 460 million years ago. At the back of the shell, the animal lived in the largest, outermost chamber. From there, it extended its tentacles forward into the water. Those tentacles could snatch fish, smaller cephalopods, or any soft-bodied creature unlucky enough to drift within reach. To move, it jetted water through a tube called a siphuncle, propelling itself backward, the same way modern squids move. A 20-foot version of this creature moving through open water was terrifying by Ordovician standards. Most of the other predators in the ocean at the time were small. The jawless fish were filter feeders. The trilobites were bottom crawlers. Orthoceras hunted in 3 dimensions, able to rise to the surface or drop to the depths, following prey wherever it fled. Scientists have found Orthoceras fossils on every single continent, including Antarctica. This tells us the creature spread across the entire global ocean and thrived in multiple ocean zones. Some formations contain hundreds of fossils layered together, suggesting mass die-offs, possibly from sudden drops in oxygen or temperature that killed entire local populations at once. One thing about Orthoceras fossils that surprises most people: they are everywhere in the fossil trade. You have almost certainly seen one without knowing it. The black polished slabs sold in rock shops, the ones with pale torpedo-shaped forms embedded inside, are almost always Orthoceras fossils. They are so common because they were so numerous. The Ordovician Ocean was full of them. The success of Orthoceras and its relatives tells us something important about the Ordovician. It was an ocean where open water was conquered, where a creature with good buoyancy control, a grasping set of tentacles and a strong shell could go anywhere and eat almost anything. It was an ocean with vertical layers of predators, each dominating its own zone. That complexity made it beautiful. It also made it fragile, because the Ordovician Ocean was about to encounter something it had no defense against. Something that came not from within the ocean but from the behavior of the planet itself. Something cold and fast by geological standards. Catastrophically fast. The ocean froze, and most of what was living in it died. The late Ordovician mass extinction, which peaked around 445 million years ago, is the second largest extinction event in Earth's history. It killed off somewhere between 82 and 85% of all ocean species. Read that again slowly. Out of every 20 species alive in the Ordovician Ocean, roughly 17 of them were gone by the end, and the cause was ice. It started with a supercontinent called Gondwana drifting over the South Pole. As that massive landmass settled over the polar region, conditions shifted. Glaciers formed on its surface, ice sheets spread, and as more and more water got locked up in those ice sheets, sea levels dropped. Scientists estimate sea levels fell by somewhere between 200 and 300 feet over a relatively short period. That drop was catastrophic. Almost all of the ocean's most diverse ecosystems lived in shallow water on the continental shelves that surrounded the ancient landmasses. As the sea retreated, those shelves were exposed. The shallow seas drained. The coral reefs, the crinoid forests, the trilobite populations, the vast beds of brachiopods, all of them lost their habitat. What had taken hundreds of millions of years to build was drained away like water out of a bathtub. At the same time, the cold water circulating down from the poles pushed into lower latitudes. The temperature of the ocean dropped across large sections of the globe. Cold water holds less oxygen in warm zones, and the shift in circulation pulled oxygen away from places that used to have it. Dead zones appeared. Creatures that needed oxygenated water suffocated. And then, just as the Ice Age seemed to stabilize, it began to reverse. The glaciers melted, sea levels rebounded, but the rebound brought its own disaster. Warmer water flooded back over seafloors that had been exposed and disrupted. The chemistry of the returning water was different, and the creatures that had managed to survive the cold and low oxygen now faced a second wave of disruption as conditions rapidly shifted again. 2 pulses of extinction. Cold, then warm. Drop, then rise. Each one deadly. Orthoceras survived. Some trilobites survived. Graptolites were nearly wiped out but pulled through with a handful of species. The great nautiloid predators that dominated the open water were drastically reduced. The reef ecosystems collapsed completely. It would take millions of years for reef systems to rebuild. What replaced the Ordovician Ocean was quieter, emptier, less diverse in almost every way. But survival selects for toughness. The creatures that made it through the late Ordovician extinction were the ones that could handle rapid change, temperature swings, oxygen drops, and habitat loss. Those survivors rebuilt, and slowly, over millions of years, they filled the ocean again with something new, something harder, something armoured. The age of fish was coming, and the fish arriving in the next ocean would look nothing like the ones alive today. The Devonian period began about 419 million years ago, and the ocean it contained was unlike anything that had come before. The survivors of the Ordovician extinction had rebuilt, slowly, carefully. The empty ecological zones, the open predator slots, the vacant reef systems, all refilled over tens of millions of years. By the time the Devonian was fully underway, the ocean was diverse again, but the creatures filling it were fundamentally different from the Ordovician cast. Fish had arrived, and these were not the delicate, jawless, filter-feeding fish of the early ocean. These were fish with jaws, with armour, with ambitions. The Devonian is sometimes called the Age of Fishes because fish diversified faster and into more extreme forms during this period than at any other time in their history. The oceans split into ecosystems dominated by different groups, each one evolving more and more extreme body shapes to fill their ecological role. One group that defined the Devonian was called placoderms, armoured fish covered in bony plates that functioned like a suit of biological armour. The plates covered their heads and the front section of their bodies, fused into a rigid shield. Behind the shield, the body was covered in scales or smooth skin. This design gave them protection at the front, where most attacks come from, while keeping the rear of the body flexible for swimming. Placoderms range from small bottom dwellers just a few inches long to giants that pushed 30 feet, in the case of the largest species. They filled nearly every ecological niche in the Devonian Ocean. Some were bottom feeders with flat crushing teeth for grinding shellfish. Some were open water predators. Some filtered plankton. The group diversified into over 1,000 known species during the Devonian, and the ocean floor itself had transformed. Devonian reefs were enormous, built by ancient corals and stromatoporoids, sponge-like organisms that secreted calcium carbonate into massive reef structures. These reefs rivaled the Great Barrier Reef in scale. They stretched for hundreds of miles along ancient continental shelves and supported ecosystems as complex and layered as any in the ocean's history. The water column above those reefs was full of life. Sharks appeared in the Devonian, some of the earliest known species showing up in the fossil record around 420 million years ago. Early sharks were smaller and more varied in body shape than modern ones, with some species carrying elaborate head crests and fin spines. They were experimenting with forms, and in the middle of all this, one-armored fish became something legendary. It developed the most powerful bite of any animal alive in its time. Its jaws were made of bone instead of teeth, sharpened by use into blades that could cut through almost anything in the ocean. Its name was Dunkleosteus, and it could bite harder than a crocodile. It had no teeth. It did not need them. Dunkleosteus was a placoderm, one of the armoured fish that dominated the Devonian Ocean. But it was not a typical placoderm. While most of its relatives were modest in size, Dunkleosteus grew to somewhere between 18 and 30 feet long, the higher end comparable in length to a school bus. The front half of its body was encased in thick, interlocking bony plates. The rear half was a powerful, muscular tail built for acceleration. What made Dunkleosteus unique was its jaw. Scientists have studied the mechanics of that jaw extensively, and the numbers are extraordinary. The bite force generated by Dunkleosteus ranked among the most powerful of any fish in Earth's history. Instead of teeth, the bone plates of its upper and lower jaw were shaped into razor-edged blades. As it opened and closed its mouth, those blades slid past each other like scissors, sharpening themselves with every bite. The jaw was also built for speed. Dunkleosteus could open its mouth in 1/50th of a second. That is faster than a human eye can track. The motion created a vacuum that sucked prey directly into the mouth before the prey could react. Open, vacuum, snap. Prey had almost no time to respond. Scientists reconstructing its diet found evidence that Dunkleosteus was eating heavily armoured animals, other placoderms, early sharks, large crustaceans. Fossils found in the same deposits as Dunkleosteus often show bite marks that match its jaw geometry. Some specimens of prey fish appear to have been folded in half by the force of the bite, the spine bent backward by the crushing pressure. There is something else about Dunkleosteus that paleontologists discovered more recently, something that changes how we picture it. For a long time, reconstruction showed it as a broad, torpedo-shaped predator. New research analysing its bone proportions suggests it may actually have been more eel-like in the rear, with a body that tapered dramatically behind the armour. Thinner, more flexible, built less like a tank and more like a missile with armour on the front. This creature ruled the Devonian Ocean for millions of years. It had no real predators. Sharks of its time were smaller and less armoured. Other placoderms were either smaller than Dunkleosteus or in a completely different part of the food chain. At the top of the Devonian Ocean, Dunkleosteus sat alone, and then the Devonian ended. An extinction event hit the ocean 4 times in succession, each pulse killing off species before the ecosystem had time to recover. The great reef systems of the Devonian collapsed. Placoderms, the group that had dominated for over 50 million years, vanished completely. Dunkleosteus and every related species disappeared from the fossil record. But just before the extinction hit, something else had already happened. something that connected the ocean to a completely new world, something that would change the entire history of life on land. Fish had started walking. The fish did not leap onto land. It crawled, slowly, reluctantly, over millions of years, and it changed the history of every creature that has ever walked on Earth, including every human being alive today. Around 375 million years ago, in shallow coastal waters and swampy river deltas, a group of fish called lobe-finned fish were experimenting with something new. Their fins were thick and muscular, built around a bone structure that already looked remarkably similar to the bones inside a human arm and hand. They used those fins to prop themselves up in shallow water, push along the muddy bottom, and navigate through dense aquatic vegetation. Scientists discovered one of the most important pieces of this story in 2004 when a team excavating in northern Canada found a remarkable fossil. A fish with a neck. A fish that could turn its head independently from its body, which fish cannot do. It had ribs. It had primitive wrist bones. It could prop itself up on its fins and look around. Scientists named it Tiktaalik. Tiktaalik was found in rock formed from an ancient river delta, exactly the kind of shallow, muddy, oxygen-poor environment where scientists had predicted the water-to-land transition would have happened. The animal still had gills, but it also had primitive lungs. It could breathe air when the water around it became too stagnant to provide enough oxygen. That ability was the key. Shallow Devonian coastal waters frequently ran low on oxygen. Fish that could gulp air had a survival advantage. Over millions of generations, that advantage compounded. Fins became more limb-like. Breathing through the mouth became more efficient. The body shifted to support weight outside of water. The transition was not a single moment. Scientists have found a series of fossils spanning millions of years, each one slightly more adapted for land. Some could shuffle on their fins. Some had feet with too many toes, experiments in limb design that evolution eventually settled on 5 per foot for most land animals. The first fully terrestrial animals descended from these fish, and from those first land animals came everything that has ever walked, crawled, slithered, or run on the surface of this planet. Reptiles, mammals, birds. Every one of them traces a direct lineage back to a lobe-finned fish in a Devonian swamp. But the ocean those fish left behind was already in trouble. The same extinction pulses that would eventually destroy Dunkleosteus were beginning. The warm, reef-filled Devonian seas were cooling. Oxygen levels in the ocean were dropping. Dead zones were spreading across the seafloor, and the worst was still ahead. Because after the Devonian, the ocean would face 4 separate extinction pulses, each one hitting before the previous one had healed. What came out of that was a planet barely recognizable, and then something even worse was waiting. 4 times the ocean nearly died, and the worst part is that scientists still are not entirely sure what caused it. The late Devonian extinction is actually a series of events spread across roughly 20 million years, from about 375 to 359 million years ago. Scientists have identified at least 2 major extinction peaks, and possibly as many as 4 separate pulses, each one killing off large numbers of species before the ocean could rebuild. By the end of the entire sequence, somewhere between 70 and 80% of all marine species were gone. The Great Devonian reef systems, the most extensive in Earth's history at that point, collapsed completely and did not return for millions of years. The placoderms, the armoured fish that had dominated the ocean for 50 million years, vanished entirely. Several major groups of fish, corals and marine invertebrates disappeared or were reduced to just a few surviving lineages. Scientists have proposed multiple causes, and most now think several factors work together. One major driver appears to have been the rise of land plants. Land plants had been spreading across the continents during the Devonian, growing from simple mats near the water's edge into complex forests with deep root systems by the late part of the period. Those roots broke apart rock, releasing nutrients into rivers and eventually into the ocean. The nutrient flood triggered massive algae blooms. Those blooms consumed oxygen as they decomposed. Dead zones spread across the seafloor, suffocating anything that lived there. At the same time, global temperatures were dropping. The spread of land plants was pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis, weakening the greenhouse effect and cooling the planet. Cooler temperatures meant less oxygen dissolved in warm surface water and the circulation of cold, oxygen-poor water across wider areas of the ocean. Several impacts from space are also suspected during this window, with some rock formations showing chemical signatures consistent with asteroid or comet strikes. Whether those strikes delivered a killing blow or simply added stress to an already collapsing system is still being debated. What makes the late Devonian extinction particularly brutal is the timeline. The ocean would begin recovering after one pulse, species diversity would start to climb, ecosystems would begin to stabilize, and then another pulse would hit and knock it back down. Recovery, collapse, recovery, collapse. 4 times, sharks survived. That fact matters. While almost every other major group of ocean predators was wiped out, sharks made it through. Their relative resilience during extinction events is a pattern that would repeat over and over again through Earth's history. The ocean that emerged from the late Devonian was emptier, quieter, less architecturally complex than the reef-filled Devonian seas. It took millions of years to rebuild, and just as it was beginning to recover, just as life was starting to diversify again, something far worse was approaching, something that would make every previous extinction look survivable by comparison. The ocean was about to face the worst moment in the history of life on Earth. The Permian Ocean had everything. By the time the Permian period was in full swing, around 290 million years ago, the ocean had rebuilt itself from the Devonian collapse. What grew back was something extraordinary. Coral reefs had returned, built this time by a different group of corals, more robust and more diverse than their Devonian predecessors. The seafloor was covered in crinoid meadows, sea lilies waving in the current like an underwater forest. Brachiopods blanketed the bottom in vast populations. Ammonoids, relatives of the Orthoceras lineage but coiled into tight spirals, filled the water column in enormous numbers, and sharks everywhere. By the Permian, sharks had been refining their design for over 150 million years. They came in shapes that would look completely alien today. One species called Helicoprion carried a spiral of teeth inside its jaw, stacked in a rotating whirl that coiled inward like a circular saw. Scientists spent over a century debating where exactly that tooth whirl sat in the animal's body, looking at dozens of interpretations before medical imaging of a well-preserved fossil finally revealed that the whirl filled the lower jaw and rotated as the shark bit, slicing through prey with a motion unlike any other predator in ocean history. Another Permian shark called Adestus grew teeth that projected forward and slightly outward from both the upper and lower jaw, like 2 crossing scissors blades sticking out of its face. The function of those teeth is still debated. But beyond the bizarre predators, the Permian Ocean supported a web of life, with more complex ecological connections than anything the ocean had held before. Predators depended on prey populations. Prey populations depended on plankton blooms. Plankton blooms depended on ocean chemistry. Every level of the food web was linked. That linkage was the ocean's greatest strength. It was also its greatest vulnerability. Because when something attacked the foundation of that web, the damage did not stop at the bottom. It cascaded upward through every layer. When the plankton died, the creatures eating plankton starved. When those creatures starved, the predators eating them starved. The whole structure collapsed from the base, and that is exactly what was about to happen. Deep beneath the landmass that would become Siberia, a volcanic system was building pressure. An enormous region of rock heated by mantle activity was preparing to crack the surface and release the largest volcanic eruption in the last 500 million years. The eruptions would continue for nearly 1 million years. They would inject enough carbon dioxide, sulfur, and toxic gases into the atmosphere to fundamentally alter the chemistry of both the air and the ocean. 96% of all ocean species were about to be erased. The Permian Ocean, with all its complexity and beauty and strangeness, was living on borrowed time. The next chapter is where it all breaks apart. The ocean turned to acid, and almost everything in it died. 252 million years ago, a volcanic system beneath what is now Siberia cracked open and began erupting. Not a single volcano, a region of the Earth's crust roughly the size of the continental United States venting lava, ash, and gas for nearly 1 million years. Scientists call the result the Siberian Traps. The lava flows produced are still visible today, covering an area of about 2 million square miles. The eruptions pumped enormous quantities of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide drove global temperatures up by somewhere between 8 and 18 degrees Fahrenheit. That warming hit the ocean immediately. Warm water holds less oxygen than cold water, and as ocean temperatures climbed, oxygen levels in the water dropped. Species adapted to specific temperature and oxygen ranges began dying in their local zones. But the warming was only the first blow. The carbon dioxide dissolving into the ocean reacted with the water and formed carbonic acid. Ocean acidity rose sharply, a process called ocean acidification. For creatures that built shells or skeletons from calcium carbonate, this was catastrophic. The acid dissolved their shells from the outside while they were still alive. Corals, brachiopods, sea urchins, and mollusks died in massive numbers as the chemistry of the water attacked the very structures keeping them alive. Then the oxygen crash hit the deep ocean. As surface temperatures rose, the circulation of oxygen-rich water from the surface down to the seafloor slowed and eventually stopped in many regions. The deep ocean became anoxic, meaning it had almost no oxygen at all. Creatures living on and near the seafloor suffocated. The seafloor communities, the most diverse ecosystems in the ocean, went silent. At the same time, evidence suggests that the warming triggered massive releases of frozen methane from ocean sediments, a compound called methane hydrate that sits locked in cold sediment on the seafloor. When that methane released, it drove temperatures even higher, creating a feedback loop. Warming released methane. Methane caused more warming, which released more methane. The ocean did not die quietly or quickly. Scientists can read the disaster layer by layer in ancient rock. Species disappear from the fossil record in waves, some vanishing early in the crisis, others holding on longer before collapsing. The process took tens of thousands of years, which is nearly instant in geological terms, but was drawn out enough that dying ecosystems had time to decompose and be recorded in the sediment. By the end, 96% of all marine species were gone. The reefs had vanished. The crinoid forests were silent. The ammonoid populations had collapsed to a handful of surviving lineages. Sharks made it through, as they always seem to. A small number of mollusks, some worms, some microbial communities in oxygen-poor zones survived. The ocean that remained was nearly empty. The food webs had shredded from the base upward. In some regions of the ancient sea floor, scientists find a layer of rock with almost no fossils at all. A dead zone preserved in stone, a record of the moment the ocean fell silent. And then, very slowly against every expectation, something began to stir. The ocean, after the Great Dying, was an almost empty world. Picture the largest, most complex coral reef you can imagine. Every single organism on it dead. The skeleton of the reef still standing, but hollow. No fish moving through it. No worms in the sediment. No plankton blooming in the water above. The structure of the ecosystem intact, but the life inside it gone. That is roughly what large sections of the ocean floor looked like in the early Triassic period, just after the Permian extinction. Scientists call some of these zones dead zones or disaster beds. They are preserved in ancient rock formations across the world, thick layers of sediment with almost no fossils, followed eventually by the first thin traces of recovery beginning to appear at the top. recovery was slow for a specific reason. The same conditions that caused the extinction had not immediately resolved. Ocean temperatures remained elevated for millions of years. Acidity stayed high. Oxygen levels in many parts of the ocean remained dangerously low. Each time a population of creatures began to rebuild in a recovering zone, a pulse of renewed volcanism or a shift in ocean chemistry could knock it back down. Scientists studying the recovery have identified what they call dead zones within the recovery itself, intervals during the early Triassic where the fossil record goes almost completely silent for millions of years at a time. Life would begin coming back, diversity would start to increase, and then conditions would deteriorate again and erase the progress. The creatures that came back first were the opportunists, small, simple, fast to reproduce, disaster species scientists sometimes call them, organisms that thrive precisely because the complex predator-prey networks that would normally keep them in check have collapsed. Certain snail-like mollusks appeared in enormous numbers across early Triassic formations worldwide. The same few species repeated over and over across thousands of miles of ancient seafloor. Diversity was crushed. Abundance was concentrated into a handful of survivors. Slowly, over millions of years, the chemistry stabilized. Ocean temperatures cooled. Oxygen returned to the deep water. The volcanic activity in Siberia finally quieted. And as conditions improved, more complex organisms began reappearing. Ammonoids, the coiled cephalopods that had been nearly wiped out, came roaring back. Their ability to reproduce quickly and adapt to different water conditions made them exceptional survivors. Within a few million years of the extinction, ammonoid diversity was climbing again, eventually reaching levels even higher than before the Great Dying. Reefs took far longer. The coral groups that had built the Permian reefs were gone. New reef builders had to evolve and establish themselves. The first new reef systems of the Triassic were simpler, more patchy, and less architecturally complex than what had existed before. True reef ecosystems comparable in scale to Permian ones did not return for roughly 10 million years. 10 million years. That is the length of time it takes a destroyed ocean ecosystem to rebuild. And during those 10 million years of recovery, the ocean was being quietly colonized by the ancestors of some of the most terrifying creatures it would ever hold. Reptiles had entered the water, and they were getting very good at it. They came from land, and then they went back to the ocean and became monsters. Mosasaurs were reptiles that evolved from land-living lizard ancestors and returned to the sea roughly 100 million years ago. By the time they reached their peak in the late Cretaceous period, around 75 million years ago, they had transformed so completely that almost nothing about them looked like a land animal anymore. The limbs had become flippers. The tail had developed a vertical fin for propulsion, similar to a shark's tail but working differently. The body was long, muscular, and built for speed in the water. The largest mosasaur species grew to lengths of 50 to 57 feet, roughly the size of a school bus, making them among the largest predators the ocean has ever held. Scientists have found skull specimens from the biggest individuals that measure over 5 feet long on their own. The jaws contain 2 rows of teeth, one on the outer edge of the jaw and a second row running along the palate inside the mouth, similar to the arrangement in some modern snakes. Once something was inside a mosasaur's mouth, the inner teeth prevented escape by pointing backward, hooking into prey and pulling it deeper into the throat. Mosasaurs ate almost anything. Scientists have found stomach contents and bite marks on prey fossils that include large fish, sharks, sea turtles, plesiosaurs, diving birds, and other mosasaurs. One specimen found with the remains of a smaller mosasaur inside its body cavity is direct evidence that the larger species ate their own relatives. What made mosasaurs extraordinary as predators was their combination of size, speed, and sensory ability. Like modern monitor lizards and snakes, they almost certainly had forked tongues that functioned as chemical sensors, tasting the water the way a snake tastes the air, tracking the chemical traces left by prey. Combined with eyes adapted for underwater vision and a streamlined body capable of rapid acceleration, a mosasaur was a hunting machine with multiple overlapping sensory systems. They also gave birth to live young in the open ocean, rather than coming ashore to lay eggs the way sea turtles do. This freed them from any dependence on land whatsoever. Scientists found evidence for this in fossils showing small mosasaurs preserved within the body cavity of larger females. For roughly 20 million years, mosasaurs dominated the ocean in a way that few predators in Earth's history have matched. They occupied the very top of the food chain across every ocean on the planet. There were nowhere near enough large prey items to limit their population significantly. And then, 66 million years ago, the asteroid hit. What happened to the ocean in the minutes, hours, and years after that impact is something almost no one talks about. Before the mosasaurs fully took over, the Mesozoic ocean had a different kind of terror. Plesiosaurs appeared roughly 210 million years ago, during the Triassic period, and survived until the asteroid impact 66 million years ago. For nearly 150 million years, they patrolled every ocean on Earth in multiple forms, ranging from the short-necked, large-headed predators called pliosaurs to the long-necked, small-headed forms that most people picture when they hear the word plesiosaur. The long-necked forms are where the sea monster legends came from. When the first complete plesiosaur fossils were described by scientists in the early 19th century, even the scientists who found them struggled to believe what they were looking at. One described it as a snake threaded through the body of a turtle. The neck alone, in some species, made up more than half the animal's total length. A plesiosaur reaching 30 feet total could have a neck exceeding 15 feet, longer than most living room walls. How they actually used those necks has been debated for over a century. For a long time, illustrations showed them rearing their heads high out of the water like a swan, scanning the surface for fish, but their neck bones and muscle attachments make that posture nearly impossible. The neck could not lift its own weight in air. Instead, scientists now think long-necked plesiosaurs used their necks horizontally in the water, sweeping them sideways to herd or ambush schools of fish, or reaching down into the seafloor sediment to grab soft-bodied prey. Their movement through the water was unlike anything alive today. 4 large wing-shaped flippers, each one working like an underwater wing rather than a paddle. Scientists studying plesiosaur locomotion found that they likely flew through the water the way sea turtles and penguins do today, using the lift generated by their flippers rather than rowing with them. This gave them exceptional maneuverability at moderate speeds. When scientists began finding plesiosaur fossils in Antarctica in the late Cretaceous rock, they discovered something unexpected. Some species had gastroliths inside them, rocks swallowed deliberately and carried in the stomach. Modern animals use swallowed rocks in 2 ways: to help grind food in the stomach, or to adjust buoyancy by adding ballast. For plesiosaurs, the rocks may have helped them dive deeper or stay stable at depth. Plesiosaur fossils have been found on every continent, including Antarctica and the high Arctic. They lived in polar waters, tropical seas, and open ocean far from any coastline. Some species were clearly deep divers. Others seem to have hunted in shallow coastal zones. Every fossil that washed up on European beaches in the 1800s, every skeleton dredged from chalk deposits in Kansas, every bone fragment found eroding from cliffs, added another layer to the legend of the sea serpent. The neck, the tiny head, the enormous body. Humans had been finding these bones for centuries before science had a name for them. The creature that gave rise to every sea monster myth was real, and the real version was stranger than the legend. Something even bigger was waiting, something that had a skull the size of a small car. There is a plesiosaur skull mounted in a museum in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that stops people cold when they walk past it. It is 9 feet long. Kronosaurus was a pliosaur, one of the short-necked, large-headed group of plesiosaurs that traded the long neck for a massive weapon-grade skull and correspondingly enormous jaw muscles. where long-necked plesiosaurs were precise hunters using their reach and maneuverability. Plesiosaurs like Kronosaurus were blunt instruments, massive, fast over short distances, built to chase down and crush the largest prey in the ocean. The complete animal stretched to somewhere between 36 and 40 feet long. The skull alone accounts for roughly a quarter of that total length, a proportion that tells you immediately this animal was built around its bite. The jaws contained large conical teeth, each one shaped for gripping rather than slicing, designed to puncture and hold rather than cut. Kronosaurus was built to seize prey that was too large to swallow whole and hold it until it stopped struggling. Scientists analysing the bite force suggest it exceeded that of a saltwater crocodile. Given that crocodiles regularly take prey far larger than themselves, the implications for what Kronosaurus could hunt in the Cretaceous ocean are significant. Fossils from Australian Cretaceous deposits, where Kronosaurus lived around 100 million years ago, include the remains of large marine turtles with damage consistent with Kronosaurus bite marks. Long-necked plesiosaurs of substantial size were also in the same ecosystem, and there is strong reason to believe they were prey. The ocean Kronosaurus lived in covered much of what is now the Australian interior. During the Cretaceous, sea levels were dramatically higher than today, and a shallow inland sea called the Eromanga Sea flooded a large part of the Australian continent. Kronosaurus patrolled those warm, shallow waters and the deeper ocean beyond them. Its front and rear flippers were massive, each one proportionally larger relative to body size than those of the long-necked plesiosaurs. This gave it substantial acceleration. For an animal that hunted by ambush or short pursuit, rather than long-distance chasing, explosive speed over a short distance was more important than endurance. One thing that makes Kronosaurus particularly impressive in the context of the Mesozoic ocean is what it tells us about predator stacking. Kronosaurus was not the only large predator in its ecosystem. Mosasaurs were present, sharks were present, large marine crocodiles were present. The Cretaceous ocean had apex predators layered at multiple levels, each one dominating a slightly different zone or prey type. Every layer of that system was enormous by modern standards, but the ocean Kronosaurus swam through was not just defined by its predators. The water itself was radically different from today's ocean in ways that are hard to picture, because the Cretaceous ocean was not where it is now. Stand in the middle of Kansas, flat farmland stretching to every horizon. 100 million years ago, you would have been standing on the floor of an ocean. During the Cretaceous period, which lasted from roughly 145 million years ago to 66 million years ago, global sea levels were dramatically higher than they are today. Scientists estimate the peak was somewhere between 600 and 900 feet above current sea level. That is the height of a 70-story building, in terms of water depth added to the coasts. The result was that the ocean covered enormous portions of every continent on Earth. In North America, a shallow sea called the Western Interior Seaway split the continent in two from north to south. It stretched from what is now the Arctic Ocean all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, covering the entire interior of the continent under water that was, in places, several hundred feet deep. Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, South Dakota, and dozens of other states that are now landlocked were entirely submerged. The same thing was happening globally. Europe was largely a scattered archipelago of islands, the shallow seas between them teeming with marine life. Africa had a shallow sea cutting across its northern interior. Australia was partially flooded. The ocean covered more of Earth's land surface during the Cretaceous than at almost any other point in the last 500 million years. What caused sea levels to be so high? Two main factors. First, the Cretaceous had almost no polar ice. Both poles were covered in forests rather than ice sheets. Without ice locking up vast quantities of water on land, all of that water stayed in the ocean. Second, the ocean floor itself was higher during the Cretaceous because the rate of seafloor spreading was faster. As tectonic plates moved apart more rapidly, Hot new rock pushed up from below, making the ocean floor bulge upward and displacing the water on top of it toward the coasts. The Western Interior Seaway was a warm, shallow, productive body of water. Its depth averaged around 2,000 feet at the centre, shallowing dramatically near the coasts. It supported one of the richest marine ecosystems of the Cretaceous, packed with fish, ammonites, marine reptiles, and early diving birds. Scientists have reconstructed this lost sea in remarkable detail, because the sediments it left behind are now exposed as rock formations across the American Midwest. Chalk deposits in Kansas contain extraordinary fossil preservation, enough to rebuild entire ecosystems. Fish fossils are found with their last meal still inside them. Marine reptile skeletons are recovered nearly complete, and in those chalky Cretaceous layers, one creature shows up in enormous numbers, a creature with a shell shaped like a coiled spring, found in sizes ranging from a quarter to wider than a hula hoop. The ammonites were coming, a shell 5 feet across, coiled into a perfect spiral, drifting through the Cretaceous ocean like a slowly rotating wheel. That was Parapuzosia seponradensis, the largest ammonite species ever found. Scientists recovered a specimen with a diameter of over 5.5 feet. The living animal inside that shell, trailing tentacles and propelling itself through the water, would have been one of the most visually striking creatures in the Cretaceous Sea. Ammonites were cephalopods, relatives of today's squids and nautiluses. Like the orthoceras of the Ordovician, they built chambered shells and controlled their buoyancy using gas-filled compartments. But where orthoceras built straight conical shells, ammonites coiled theirs into tight spirals. This shape had significant advantages. The coil distributed the shell's weight more evenly and made the animal more stable in the water column. It also made the shell stronger under pressure. What ammonites lacked, which surprises most people, is a hard beak or jaw like a nautilus. Scientists believe many ammonites fed on soft prey, small fish, plankton, and soft-bodied invertebrates that they could capture with their tentacles without needing crushing power. The giant species likely fed on whatever they could catch that was soft enough to handle. Ammonites were extraordinarily diverse. Scientists have identified over 10,000 individual species, making them one of the most species-rich groups in the entire fossil record. They range from species smaller than a fingernail to the 5-foot giants. Some species coiled in the normal flat spiral. Others formed loose, uncoiling spirals that looked like a stretched spring. Others bent into hook shapes or irregular corkscrew patterns. The variety of shell shapes in ammonites is so extreme that scientists have used them as precision timekeeping tools for dating rock formations. Because ammonites evolved and went extinct quickly by geological standards, finding a specific ammonite species in a rock layer tells scientists almost exactly when that rock formed. Ammonites were also extraordinarily abundant. They appear in the fossil record in enormous quantities across every ocean formation from the Devonian through to the end of the Cretaceous. They were likely a primary food source for many of the large marine predators of the Mesozoic: mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, large fish, and marine crocodiles all likely ate them in significant numbers, and they were a major part of the open water food web, consuming vast quantities of plankton and in turn being consumed by almost everything larger. Ammonites survived every mass extinction from the Devonian through the end of the Permian. They survived the Triassic extinction. They survived events that wiped out the majority of ocean life multiple times. Each time, a handful of surviving lineages diversified rapidly and refilled the ocean, until the asteroid. The asteroid killed every ammonite species on Earth. Not one survived. After surviving 4 mass extinctions spanning over 300 million years, they were gone in what geologists call an instant. But before the asteroid arrived, the Cretaceous ocean had one more layer of horror to reveal. The Jurassic Ocean was a layered system of killers. Every depth, every zone, every ecological niche had something at the top of it. and near the very top of that entire system, in the warm, shallow seas that covered much of what is now Western Europe 160 million years ago, sat Liopleurodon. Liopleurodon was a pliosaur, the same short-necked, enormous skulled group that produced Kronosaurus. Its size has been exaggerated dramatically in popular media, with some television documentaries claiming lengths of over 80 feet. The actual fossil evidence supports something between 20 and 33 feet, which is still extraordinary. The skull alone reached lengths of around 5 feet, and the jaw muscles attached to it were among the most powerful of any marine reptile. What made Liopleurodon stand out in its ecosystem was its sensory system. Scientists analysing the skull found nostrils positioned in a way that would have allowed it to detect the direction of chemical signals in the water with precision. Essentially, it could track prey by scent through the ocean, the way a predator on land uses smell to follow a trail. Combined with its size and acceleration, this made it a predator that could locate prey at a distance and close the gap rapidly. The Jurassic Ocean it hunted in was packed with prey. Large fish, including some species exceeding 20 feet in length, filled the water column. Long-necked plesiosaurs of multiple species hunted smaller fish. Marine crocodiles, some of them fully adapted to open ocean life with fish-like tails and finned limbs, occupied the shallower coastal zones. Belemnites, squid-like creatures with hard internal shells, swarmed in enormous numbers. Ichthyosaurs, dolphin-shaped reptiles that had been in the ocean since the Triassic, were still present and numerous. Every layer of the water column had a predator. The very deep had large, slow-moving hunters. The middle water column had faster, medium-sized predators chasing fish schools. The surface layer had the ichthyosaurs, and above them all, capable of hunting in any zone it chose, was Liopleurodon. This kind of predator stacking, multiple apex predators each occupying a slightly different ecological role, is what scientists call a complex trophic structure. It requires an enormous amount of prey biomass at the base to sustain all those large predators at the top. The Jurassic Ocean had that biomass in abundance because ocean productivity was extremely high during this period. Warm temperatures, abundant nutrients, and well-circulating ocean currents all driving massive plankton blooms that fed everything above them. The system was balanced, intricate, each predator keeping others in check, each prey population regulated from multiple directions. And then, 66 million years ago, something the ocean had no defense against arrived from space. The balance was about to be destroyed in a matter of hours. The asteroid hit what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico at roughly 43,000 miles per hour. The impact released energy estimated at roughly 1 billion times the strength of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. In the first seconds, everything within several hundred miles was vaporized. The ocean near the impact site was pushed aside by the force, exposing the seafloor momentarily before a massive wave rushed back in. The initial shock wave travelled through the Earth's crust, triggering earthquakes and volcanic activity around the globe within hours. But what happened to the ocean specifically is something that rarely gets discussed. The energy of the impact superheated the atmosphere above the impact zone almost instantly. A thermal pulse radiated outward from the impact site, and where that pulse hit the ocean surface, the water temperature spiked dramatically. Scientists studying the event estimate that the surface layer of the ocean in the impact zone and across large surrounding areas was effectively cooked by the thermal radiation within the first hours after impact. The top layer of the ocean, where sunlight normally penetrates and where almost all photosynthesis happens, experienced a rapid temperature surge. Everything living in that surface layer in the affected region died quickly from heat alone. But the larger disaster unfolded over the following months. The impact vaporized billions of tons of rock, sending a cloud of debris, dust, and sulfur compounds into the upper atmosphere. That cloud spread globally. Within weeks, it was thick enough to block sunlight across the entire planet. The ocean, which depends almost entirely on sunlight to drive photosynthesis at the surface, went dark. Phytoplankton, the microscopic algae that form the base of nearly every ocean food web on Earth, died in massive numbers as light vanished. Zooplankton, the tiny animals that feed on phytoplankton, followed. Then the small fish that fed on zooplankton. Then the larger fish. The food web collapsed from the bottom up, the same pattern as the Great Dying, but caused by darkness rather than acidity and heat. The cooling was rapid. Global temperatures plunged as sunlight was blocked. The ocean surface cooled dramatically in some regions. Animals adapted to the warm Cretaceous seas were suddenly living in an ocean that was cooling, darkening, and running out of food at every level simultaneously. Mosasaurs starved. Plesiosaurs vanished. The giant marine reptiles that had dominated the ocean for millions of years had no prey left and no way to wait out the darkness. Ammonites, which depended on plankton as a significant part of their food base, went extinct completely. But some things survived, and how they survived tells us something remarkable about what resilience actually means. The ocean after the asteroid was a world of dying in slow motion. The initial heat pulse had killed everything near the surface in the impact zone. The darkness that followed killed everything else over the next months and years. But the deepest ocean, far below where light normally penetrates anyway, was the last refuge. In the deep ocean, away from the sunlight-dependent food webs, a different kind of life had always existed. Organisms that fed on the slow rain of organic material drifting down from the surface, bacteria breaking down dead matter, creatures adapted to near-freezing temperatures and crushing pressure. These deep ocean communities were insulated from the immediate chaos at the surface. The darkness, which was devastating for surface life, meant almost nothing for animals that had never relied on light. And so, while the surface ocean went silent, the deep kept working, slowly, with far less energy than before because the material raining down from above had largely stopped. But it kept working. Recovery came in stages. The first sign was microbial. Bacteria that could survive in near darkness and low nutrient conditions expanded rapidly after the impact, filling the chemical rolls left empty by the dead phytoplankton. These were not the complex food chains of the Cretaceous. They were simple, resilient, microscopic survivors doing what microbes always do, finding a way. Within a few thousand years, some phytoplankton lineages began recovering. Certain species of single-celled algae were more resistant to darkness than others. They expanded first, establishing a thin film of photosynthesis at the surface as the dust clouds slowly thinned and some light began filtering through. With photosynthesis returning, zooplankton populations could begin rebuilding. Then the small fish. Then slowly the larger predators. But the process was not smooth. Scientists reading the ocean rock record from the early Paleogene period, just after the impact, find repeated pulses of die-off and recovery as conditions fluctuated. Warming, then cooling. Nutrient surges, then crashes. The ocean that eventually emerged from the post-asteroid darkness was fundamentally different from the Cretaceous ocean. The giant marine reptiles were gone. Ammonites were gone. The layered system of enormous apex predators was gone. The ecological architecture that had taken millions of years to build had been erased. And into that emptied ocean, a new kind of predator was about to descend. Because while the marine reptiles had been disappearing, a group of land animals had been quietly watching the ocean from the shore. They had survived the asteroid on land. They had warm blood. They could regulate their own body temperature. And they had big brains. They were about to make a decision that would produce some of the most intelligent predators the ocean has ever held. They were going back in. Sharks have survived 5 mass extinctions. Every single one. The late Ordovician, the late Devonian, the End-Permian Great Dying, the End-Triassic extinction, and the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. Through all of them, while dominant groups of ocean life were erased, while ecosystems collapsed and rebuilt, while the chemistry of the ocean swung from one extreme to another, sharks kept going. The question is why? And the answer is not simply that sharks are tough. The real explanation is stranger and more interesting than that. Sharks first appeared in the fossil record around 450 million years ago, making them older than land animals, older than trees, older than the Atlantic Ocean itself. But the earliest sharks were not the streamlined, powerful forms most people picture today. They were experimental. Scientists have found Devonian shark fossils with fin shapes, tooth arrangements, and body structures that look nothing like any modern shark. Some had elaborate head crests. Some had bizarre spiraling teeth. They were trying out body plans the way evolution always does at the start of a new group, with enormous variety and many dead ends. What made sharks resilient through extinctions was not their specific body plan. It was their flexibility. Sharks as a group never committed too heavily to one ecological strategy. When the dominant ocean ecosystems collapsed and rebuilt, sharks were generalist enough in their basic design to fill whatever predator role became available. Their skeleton is made of cartilage, not bone. Cartilage is lighter and more flexible than bone, which reduces the energy cost of swimming. It also means sharks need less food to maintain their bodies than a bony fish of similar size. During mass extinctions, when prey populations collapse, this efficiency matters enormously. A predator that can survive longer on less food outlasts a predator that needs constant high caloric intake. Shark teeth replace continuously throughout life. A single shark can produce tens of thousands of teeth over a lifetime. Because teeth are the hardest part of a shark and resist decomposition better than cartilage, they preserve readily in sediment. This is why shark teeth are by far the most common shark fossil found, and why scientists can track shark presence through the rock record even when full skeletons are absent. The deep-water habitat proved a critical refuge during mass extinctions. When surface oceans crashed, deep-water sharks in cold, low-oxygen environments survived the disruptions better than surface-dependent species. Their populations could rebound and diversify once conditions improved. Through 5 extinctions, sharks lost individual species. Whole groups of sharks went extinct during the Great Dying and the asteroid impact. But the fundamental shark lineage always had survivors, always had populations in refuges deep enough or cold enough or remote enough to outlast the catastrophe above them. The same story played out after each extinction. A reduced shark population diversifies into the newly emptied ecological space. New species appear, new body plans emerge, and within a few million years, sharks are back near the top of the food chain. One shark lineage that diversified after the asteroid died out was so large and so recent that people still argue about whether it is truly gone. For a long time, scientists thought they knew what Megalodon looked like. They were wrong. The story of how we rebuilt Megalodon from scratch is a case study in how science corrects itself, and the real animal is, in some ways, more interesting than the oversized great white shark that popular culture made famous. Megalodon, whose full scientific name is Otodus megalodon, was a massive shark that lived from roughly 23 million years ago until about 3.5 million years ago. Its teeth, which can reach over 7 inches long, are found in marine sediments on every continent except Antarctica. Because shark skeletons are made of cartilage and almost never fossilize, those teeth are essentially all we have. No complete skeleton has ever been found. For most of the 20th century, scientists estimated Megalodon's size by comparing its teeth to the teeth of the great white shark and scaling up. This produced length estimates of around 60 to 80 feet and led to reconstructions that looked like a massively inflated great white shark. Those reconstructions were in textbooks for decades. Recent research overturned this approach. A team of scientists used a more sophisticated method, comparing Megalodon's tooth proportions to multiple shark species rather than just great whites, and also analysing the relative size of teeth from different positions in the jaw. Their revised estimate suggests Megalodon reached lengths of around 46 to 53 feet. Enormous, but significantly smaller than the older estimates. More importantly, the body shape was likely different from a great white's. Newer research suggests Megalodon may have been more slender in proportion, with a longer, more graceful body than the stocky, wedge-headed reconstruction most people have seen. Think less like a tank and more like an enormous, elongated predator built for sustained cruising. What Megalodon actually ate is better documented than its appearance. Scientists have found fossil whale bones with Megalodon bite marks on them, large parallel gouges consistent with the tooth size and jaw geometry of the shark. Megalodon appears to have targeted the large whales that proliferated in the warm Miocene Ocean. Some bite patterns suggest it attacked the flipper area of whales first, disabling them before consuming them. The cause of Megalodon's extinction remains an active area of research. The most supported explanation involves the cooling of the global ocean around 3 to 4 million years ago, as the Antarctic ice sheet expanded and ocean temperatures dropped. Megalodon appears to have preferred warm water, and as warm water whale populations shifted away from areas where Megalodon hunted, prey became scarcer. The great white shark, which tolerates cold water much better, may have outcompeted juvenile megalodons for prey in some areas. Megalodon is gone. The idea that it survives in the deep ocean is not supported by evidence. The deep ocean is cold, low in prey, and regularly explored with cameras. Megalodon was a warm water, open ocean predator that needed enormous quantities of large prey. It has not been there for over 3 million years. But something else entered the ocean around the same time Megalodon was fading. Something with warm blood and remarkable intelligence. Roughly 55 million years ago, a small deer-like mammal living near the shores of an ancient sea made a decision that would produce some of the largest and most intelligent animals in the history of the ocean. It waded in. Scientists know this because of a series of fossils discovered over the last 50 years that document step by step the transformation of a land mammal into a whale. The earliest known ancestor of whales was a creature called Pachycetus, found in rock formations in Pakistan from around 53 million years ago. It was a four-legged mammal, roughly the size of a wolf, that lived near water and probably waded in to hunt fish. Its ear bones, which have a distinctive structure unique to whales, are the clearest proof of the relationship. Nothing else has ear bones shaped that way. From Pachycetus, the lineage moved progressively into the water. A later ancestor called Ambulocetus, found in 50-million-year-old rock, was larger and more aquatic. It could walk on land but moved better in the water, swimming with an up and down motion of its spine, the same way modern whales move their flukes, rather than the side-to-side motion of fish. Its hind limbs were still functional, but were becoming more limb-like in the water than on land. By 40 million years ago, an ancestor called Basilosaurus had become fully aquatic. It had tiny vestigial hind limbs, too small to support its weight on land, clearly useless for walking but still present as an evolutionary trace. Its body had elongated dramatically, reaching lengths of around 60 feet. It was, to all appearances, a sea monster. Scientists originally thought it was a reptile when its fossils were first found in the early 19th century. The name Basilosaurus means king lizard, a mistake that stuck. The transition from land mammal to whale took roughly 15 million years, which is rapid by evolutionary standards. What drove it was the same thing that drove fish onto land hundreds of millions of years earlier: a rich food resource in the water that rewarded those who could reach it. The early Eocene ocean was warming and rich with fish. For a mammal willing to wade deeper and deeper, there was enormous food available. Modern whales retain physical evidence of this land origin. They have vestigial hip bones, no longer connected to anything, floating inside their bodies as a remnant of the pelvis they no longer need. Some whale species are occasionally born with small external hind limb buds, a developmental echo of legs that evolution removed. And despite spending their entire lives in the ocean, whales still breathe air, give birth to live young, and nurse them with milk. They are mammals in an ocean built around fish and reptile biology, running on warm blood and big brains in a world that shaped them over tens of millions of years. The intelligence whales developed made them unlike almost anything the ocean had seen before, and it raises a question that scientists have barely begun to answer. What else was the ancient ocean building in the dark and the deep that we still do not know about? The deepest part of the ocean is called the Challenger Deep. It sits in the western Pacific Ocean, inside a trench that plunges nearly 7 miles below the surface. If you dropped Mount Everest into it, the summit would still be over a mile underwater. For most of Earth's history, nothing living on the surface or in the shallow ocean knew that place existed. The deep ocean has always been there. Even in the earliest seas, the deepest zones were present. Cold, dark, pressurized beyond anything a surface creature could survive. But the life forms of the surface ocean had almost no interaction with those depths. The physical barriers, crushing pressure, near freezing temperatures and total darkness made the deep a world unto itself. What lives in the deep ocean is still being catalogued today. Scientists estimate that somewhere between 70 and 80% of ocean species have never been formally identified. The deep is that large, and human exploration of it has barely begun. By comparison, the surface of Mars has been mapped more thoroughly than the floor of Earth's ocean. 10,000 years ago, when humans were just beginning to develop agriculture, the deep ocean was as unknown to every surface creature as the surface of a distant planet. Whales can dive deep, with sperm whales reaching depths of nearly 2 miles in pursuit of giant squid. But even sperm whales are surface animals that hold their breath. They visit the deep. They do not live there. The creatures that do live in the true deep are adapted to conditions that seem impossible by surface standards. Fish that produce their own light through chemical reactions in special organs along their bodies. Squid with eyes the size of soccer balls evolved to detect the faintest trace of bioluminescence in the darkness. Shrimp that gather around hydrothermal vents where temperatures near the vent opening can exceed 700 degrees, surviving because their chemistry is adapted for heat that would denature every protein in a surface animal. Some of these deep creatures are enormous. The giant squid, the real animal behind centuries of sea monster legends, reaches lengths of around 43 feet. It was not photographed alive in its natural habitat until 2004. For all of human history before that point, the giant squid was known only from carcasses that occasionally washed ashore or were pulled up in fishing nets. The colossal squid, even larger and heavier than the giant squid, was not discovered by science until 1925, when 2 tentacles were found in the stomach of a sperm whale. A complete specimen was not recovered until 2007. These are animals that weigh close to 1,000 pounds. They were unknown to science until the last 100 years. The deep ocean hides things in plain sight by being unreachable, and what it has produced over 4 billion years of darkness and pressure and chemical complexity is a catalogue of life so strange and so enormous that scientists are certain the strangest chapters have not yet been written. But the ancient ocean does not only matter as history. What it did to the planet is still happening. The ocean has changed its chemistry 5 times in dramatic, life-altering ways, and scientists studying those changes have realized something uncomfortable. The pattern is repeating. Ocean acidification is happening now. The ocean has absorbed roughly 30% of all the carbon dioxide humans have released into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. When carbon dioxide dissolves in water, it forms carbonic acid. The same chemistry that dissolved the shells of Permian ocean creatures during the Great Dying is measurably increasing in the modern ocean today. Scientists have recorded a roughly 30% increase in ocean acidity since the pre-industrial period, a change happening at a rate far faster than most mass extinction events in the fossil record. The speed is the problem. Ocean ecosystems can adapt to slow changes over millions of years. The fossil record proves this repeatedly. Life rebounds, diversity returns, but rapid changes, the kind that happen in thousands of years rather than millions, are what the fossil record shows killing ecosystems at the root. The Great Dying killed 96% of ocean species. Ocean acidification was a primary driver. The modern ocean is experiencing the same chemistry. Ocean warming is also tracking the ancient extinction patterns. Rising global temperatures reduce the oxygen dissolved in surface water, exactly as happened during the end Permian and the asteroid aftermath. Dead zones, regions of the ocean where oxygen levels have dropped too low to support complex life, have more than quadrupled in size since the 1960s. Scientists count over 500 dead zones in the modern ocean, compared to around 45 in the 1960s. The deep ocean is warming too. Cold deep water is where oxygen-rich currents form and circulate to the rest of the ocean. As that water warms, the circulation slows. Slower circulation means less oxygen reaching the middle depths. The middle depths feed the surface. The surface feeds everything. Scientists studying the prehistoric ocean are not making these comparisons to create alarm for its own sake. They are drawing on the only database of real-world outcomes that exists. The fossil record is a record of experiments. Chemical changes were run on a global scale, and the results are preserved in rock. When scientists see modern conditions matching the conditions that preceded ancient extinctions, they are pattern matching against real data. The Permian Ocean had complex reefs, diverse predators, and rich plankton blooms. It had existed in roughly that form for tens of millions of years, and then chemistry changed faster than the ecosystem could adapt. The modern ocean is not yet at Permian levels of acidification or temperature change. There is time in the record, and the fossil record also shows something important that often gets overlooked. Life comes back, always. After every extinction, after every chemical catastrophe, after every ice age and asteroid and volcanic eruption, life returns and rebuilds. The question the fossil record cannot answer is whether the species alive during the recovery are the same ones that were alive before. They never are. In the shallows of warm coastal waters, clinging to rocks and seafloors around the world, there is an animal that was already ancient when the dinosaurs were young. It has not changed in any significant way in over 480 million years. The horseshoe crab is not actually a crab. It belongs to a separate group more closely related to spiders and scorpions than to true crabs. Its body is covered in a rounded dome-shaped shell with a long rigid tail spike trailing behind. Flip one over and you see something that looks genuinely prehistoric. 10 jointed legs arranged around a central mouth, gill-like structures called book gills fanning out behind the legs, blue blood pumping through an open circulatory system. The blue blood is not a detail. It is the reason horseshoe crabs matter urgently to modern medicine. Horseshoe crab blood contains a substance called limulus amoebocyte lysate. This compound reacts almost instantly to bacterial toxins called endotoxins. If even a trace of endotoxin contaminates a medical product, the blue blood clots around it visibly. For decades, every vaccine, injectable drug, and implantable medical device approved for use in the United States has been tested for bacterial contamination using horseshoe crab blood. The medical supply chain of the modern world depends on an animal that was crawling through Ordovician seas before fish had evolved jaws. The horseshoe crab survived the late Ordovician extinction. It survived the late Devonian extinction. It survived the Great Dying. It survived the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. It survived all 5 mass extinctions that have reshaped the ocean, and it did so in essentially the same body it has always had, the same rounded shell, the same blue blood, the same method of reproduction, coming ashore in massive groups during high tides in late spring to lay eggs in the sand, exactly as its Ordovician ancestors did. Scientists call animals like this living fossils, organisms whose body plan has remained stable while the world around them changed completely. The horseshoe crab succeeded because its design was already nearly perfect for what it needed to do. It is a bottom-dwelling, omnivorous scavenger that eats worms, mollusks, and algae. It moves slowly but requires almost no energy to do so. Its shell protects it from most predators. Its blood chemistry neutralizes bacterial threats that would kill more complex immune systems. It asks very little of the ocean and takes what it needs from the sediment. The 4 billion year story of the prehistoric ocean ends here, with this animal. An ocean that began as a purple, toxic, airless sea that would kill you in seconds. That produced life from chemistry in the dark. that built eyes, jaws, shells, and intelligence through billions of years of predation and disaster, that was nearly destroyed 5 times and rebuilt itself each time from survivors small enough to hide in the deep, or slow enough to outlast the catastrophe, or strange enough to run on chemistry no one else was using. The horseshoe crab was there for most of it, and tonight, somewhere in the warm shallows, one of them is walking slowly across the seafloor, following the same path its ancestors walked when the ocean above it was full of giant shell-crushing nautiloids and armoured fish. Nothing about the prehistoric ocean was survivable, and yet everything alive today descended from something that survived it.